My name is K Smolarz and I am a marine biologist and toxicologist working at the Institute of Oceanography at the University of Gdańsk. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to the marine spatial planning from the perspective of the marine environment. I have divided this talk into 5 consecutive parts, each focusing on a little bit different element. First, I would like to introduce you to the actual concept of environment and just tell you a little bit why is it interesting. Then we will go into the goods and services that can be provided by the marine environment as such, and we will quickly go into threats to the environment which can be seen in the ambient environment, both globally and locally. After that, we will be speaking a little bit about marine spatial planning as a platform where possibly economy and nature conservation can meet and join forces in a way to actually work together for a better protection of the environment. And finally, we will discuss some aspects of evaluation and impacts that are necessary for a proper protection of the environment from a perspective of marine spatial planning. I would like to actually go into the concept of environment. So what is it? Browsing the literature, we can actually see that there are 3 main areas of the environment, which are called natural, biophysical, and built environment. Natural environment, it is everything what is actually around us. So these are all living and non-living resources occurring naturally, and this naturally is actually a very valid and very important part of this definition. Also here we have natural systems including all vegetation, all living and natural phenomena occurring in the area. And finally, within the natural environment we have various natural resources and various physical phenomena which are lacking clear-cut boundaries. And this is also very important from a perspective of environmental protection. So going to the biophysical environment, biophysical definition, this one contains of all biotic and abiotic surroundings of a living thing. Here we have influence, everything what influences survival, development and evolution. So all the most crucial for development processes as such. Also, biophysical environment is a very much multi-scale concept, and it covers everything from gene to ocean. So from a microscopic level to a very broad global scale. Yet also we have something very new which is called the built environment. It's pretty much an environment that has been changed via human activities. All what we have here, those are man-made changes, architecture, workplaces, various also recreational ways or means which we are using on a daily basis. What is it, this environment? The term actually encompasses various interactions between biotic and abiotic factors that can create good conditions for living. And in particular, it encompasses interactions between all living species, between the climate, weather, various physical, chemical factors and variables, also various natural processes, and these days also several man-made processes or man-made interactions which are possibly affecting survival of all living things, survival of humans, and also various economic activities from a perspective of a human being. As we all know, we have 2 major types of environmental ecosystems, and those are terrestrial. Here we have like forests, ecosystem, meadows, and a very broad concept of aquatic ecosystem. Here we have various aquatic ecosystems spanning from freshwater ecosystem to marine ecosystem. Sometimes we also have brackish ecosystems that are being recognized, and one of those types of ecosystem is actually the Baltic Sea. Here we have also subdivisions, so we have coastal areas, coastal ecosystems, various estuaries, reef ecosystem, benthic ecosystem, pelagic ecosystems, and others. Within the estuaries, we also have river mouths, coastal bays, and tidal marshes, and various other water bodies behind barrier, for example, beaches. And estuaries are also very interesting ecosystems, also because they are usually characterized by lower salinity levels. So they are often connected, and they also fit into the definition of brackish ecosystems. Let's face some facts regarding the global oceans as such. First of all, we have to remember that actually ocean covers 2/3 of the planet's surface, and it provides a wide range of habitats where enormous amount of marine life is actually living. It also contains over 97% of Earth's water sources. It is also a very broad environment from a perspective of a salinity level, and the salinity spans from 1 or 2 promiles, like, for example, in some parts of the Baltic Sea, up to over 35%, as we have, for example, in the Dead Sea. The average salinity is approximately 3.5%. 45% of the global human population inhabits coastal areas, so this is also very important from a perspective of our survival. So just to say that over 50 million people depend directly only upon fishing for a living. Just to sum up this part, we can say that the global ocean is vital for human well-being. And it goes also from a perspective of global food security, various opportunities for employment and development, but also from a perspective of just entire environment. As oceans provide a wide range of habitats, as I mentioned previously, they are also home to different life species. And the biodiversity as such, it means basically the variety of life. And it also contains the variety in all life forms and interactions. It is also recognized as one of the most complex features and most vital in the biology and ecology. Biodiversity as such is a complex term, and it's actually pretty much everything between genes to oceans. So first, what we have is a genetic biodiversity or genetic diversity, which contains diversity of the various genetic resources of different species, and it also addresses genetic variation within the species that can be actually seen at the levels of genes, alleles, or chromosomes as such. Then we go into species diversity, and species diversity reflects upon the number of species that inhabit a given ecosystem. Then we have a term which is called somewhat ecosystem diversity or ecosystem biodiversity. And ecosystem diversity refers to the variety of ecosystem types. So everything what we have said before, and it spans between species up to habitats and finally to the functional diversity. The diversity of habitats and ecological processes, also the distribution and ranges of species, and pretty much the functions and role of key species in a particular ecosystem. This is all characterized by a large number of complexity, as there are enormous amount of interspecies relationships, not only interspecies, but various relationships between biotic and abiotic parts of the ecosystem. And the assessment of ecosystem diversity is always very difficult. We have several types of marine habitats that actually are very interesting from a perspective of marine environment. We have habitats like intertidal habitats, mangrove, mudflats, estuaries, kelp forest, algae habitats, various open areas, tidewater glaciers, pelagic habitats, soft and sandy bottoms, so those which are actually connected to the type of the bottom, and of course something what is pretty known already are coral reefs habitats. What is actually a habitat? That can be recognized as a place or environment where a plant or animal naturally or normally lives and grows, or a place where a given species, a particular species, can be found. That means that the term habitat is very much species specific and covers all biotic and abiotic factors supporting the survival and reproduction of a particular species. That also means that opposite to the environment, actually habitats are, as I said, pretty much species specific, while environment as such contains a very broad number of various habitats which are connected to specific species. Habitats also changeable. They can change over time, and this change can be violent but can also be very smooth. The violent change is, for example, connected to some acute events such like a volcano eruption, but also sometimes to actually human-based activities which may directly or indirectly change the entire ecosystem and all habitats which can be recognized within this ecosystem. On the other hand, we have something which is much more natural, which actually contains a seasonal change of the habitat, which is depending where we are located, but in the temperate areas, it is actually a very natural, and it also changes various abiotic factors such as temperature, light. Biotic factors include also various food availability and also several inter and intraspecies connections or interactions. Here we are speaking about interactions such as competition, for example, but also predation. Also, seasonal changes can contribute to some behavioral changes of specific species. For example, what depends on the season is sexual behavior, which is very much connected to food availability and temperature in various areas of the marine ecosystem. Now I would like to focus on two particular habitat-forming species, because the habitat is not always something what is abiotic, which is connected to a particular location, but habitat can also contain a specific species. And one of such habitat-forming species are actually blue mussels. This species is very common in the temperate hemisphere, but not only, it is also found in both southern and northern parts of the planet. It's very global. There are various species like Mytilus edulis, Mytilus trossulus, Mytilus galloprovincialis, Mytilus chilensis, but also what we have here are various hybrids, and those are basically connections between Mytilus species. So, for example, like Mytilus edulis trossulus. Why blue mussels are interesting? First of all, they are common, and we have to really stress that common species are rare. There's not so many species with the ability, which are granted the ability to survive in a broad range of environments. They are actually doing quite well there. Second, blue mussels, they do have sedentary lifestyle. They have long lifetime. What is very important, they are also recognized as a key species, and that comes in terms of energy fluxes and suspended matter uptake from the water column, something what we will be speaking about just in a moment, and something what is called a benthic-pelagic coupling. They are also able to influence the concentration of nitrogen and phosphorus compound, and by actually respiratory activities, they are able to filter enormous amount also of pollution. So they are also known as the species which is readily bioaccumulating. That means there is a certain concentration of particular compounds. Some of them are toxic into the tissues. Of course, as a key species, it is also an important food source for birds and for fish. It also is used nowadays as an indicator of temporary trends in environmental quality, both in environmental monitoring and biological, specifically biological monitoring. It also maintains the structure and integrity of macrobenthic communities, which is a very important feature of a key species. Another habitat-forming species include various species of seagrass, but also various species of macrophytes. And seagrass, one of the most known is Zostera marina or Zostera sp. Macrophytes and algae species like Fucus sp. Both of these species are reoccurring in the southern Baltic Sea area, and they were actually depleted from this part of the Baltic Sea. Those are actually large primary producers. They really offer various amount of areas which are very necessary from various perspectives into the marine life. First of all, they offer various breeding and nursery grounds for different fish species like herring, like garfish, like gobies. They also offer an important part of the food web with several species that are living there, like invertebrate species. They can be food for various other fish species, so like eels, roaches, perches, young pikes, and for example, certs, which are very difficult to actually spot nowadays in the southern Baltic Sea locations. Habitat forming species like seagrass, they are also habitats, or macrophytes in general, they are also habitats for various fish species like different type of pipefish, broad-nosed pipefish, straight-nosed pipefish, and other fish species, which can also be food for secondary carnivores, such as other fish species and birds. Also, various protected species or species under protection are inhabiting these areas. So, for example, in the southern Baltic Sea area, Zostera marina is actually one of these species which is under protection. Yet another type of macrophyte or habitats which is related to reeds growing at the shoreline, which offer, for example, shore reinforcements, protection against wind and abrasion, but also it's a very well-known nursery ground for young fish species. There are also various ecosystem functions, and ecosystem functions are also connected to a functional diversity. Here we have two main definitions that include physical, chemical, and biological processes transforming and translocated energy or materials in a particular ecosystem, and the capacity of natural processes and components to provide goods and services that satisfy human needs. Generally, functional diversity can be defined as all ecological processes controlling the fluxes of energy, nutrients, and organic matter through an environment. So something which goes via the food chain or food web and covers primary producers, covers consumers, and covers decomposers. Each of them, they are having specific functions within the particular environment, and without this group of animals, these ecosystem functions would collapse. Marine ecosystems provide also many important functions in general, and the consensus is that the ecosystem function is very much related to the ecosystem diversity. In that aspect, the larger biodiversity, the better functioning ecosystems can be expected. Alternatively, low biodiversity ecosystems are likely to be functionally poorer, and they can also be less resistant. And via resistance, we understand the capacity to resist specific change of the ecosystem. It can be acute or it can be actually more gradually occurring. Less resilient such an ecosystem can be, and with the resilient, we will understand the capacity to recover actually after such a change occurred. All that includes the disturbance, then ecosystem with species-rich communities. Low biodiversity ecosystems are pretty much supposed to recover slower and worse than high biodiversity ecosystems. We have specific organisms in a community, and these organisms are linked through what actually they eat and what eats them. So these are very basic connections among the food chain. A food chain is actually a single pathway which connects a producer with different consumers. So it can actually be from very bottom, which is solar energy coming from sun. Then we are having algae, various algae species, sometimes also macrophyte species. Then we have the primary consumers, and then we have the secondary consumers and tertiary consumers, the final consumers, which are are top of the food chain. This feeding relationship in ecosystem will consist of many interconnected food chains, and this structure forms something which is called a food web. So also here we are having energy from sun as a very base for the web to be actually formed. Then we have primary producers forming a solid base for a whole life to actually being able to occur. Then we have a primary consumers feeding on primary producers, secondary consumers feeding on primary consumers, and then finally we have large predators or tertiary consumers, quaternary consumers, which maintain the structure and integrity of various macrobenthic communities of various species interactions, like for example avoiding overpopulation of a specific component. Any part of this connection of this chain is gone, then there is a problem. Eventually, the ecosystem functions can be destroyed until the time they can be possibly rebuilt in a different way. When it comes to ecosystem functions and specifically benthing and pelagic coupling, which are mentioned when we were talking about the blue mussels bed, Mytilus edulis or Mytilus beds, benthic pelagic coupling is characterized by various processes which are connecting benthic area, so sea bottom, as we can see here, also with pelagic area. It strongly depends on the depth of marine ecosystem, pretty much because it determines the proximity and the degree of interactions between the benthic and pelagic area and the individuals that are actually inhabiting the pelagial and the sediments. Also, these processes are influenced by a number of factors, such as, for example, nutrients like nitrogen compounds, phosphorus compounds, and various silicate availability, of course, the temperature, basic water chemistry, and light conditions. It is also obvious that these processes are actually very changing seasonally, so we will indeed face a strong seasonality effect. Here at this picture, we have a very nice indication of selected processes which can be recognized as during benthic pelagic coupling. So the blue arrows are actually connected to benthic dominated processes, and this is, for example, filter feeding that is actually provided by, for example, blue mussels. This is also all suspended matter, but also, for example, the dead algae which are settling at the sea bottom. Then also various sinking particles which are also deposited on the sea bottom. Then we have wave action and the mixing process occurring, of course, the nutrient excretions, another nutrient cycling via microbial food web, and the microbes are living on the sea bottom. Finally, we also have various aspects of bioturbation, and in some ways we also have these pelagic processes which are very important, and the pelagic processes of course contain organism movement, emergence, as well as larval drift and settling. Larval settling is pretty much benthic, while larval drift is pretty much pelagic, because various benthic species are actually having pelagic larval forms and then freely swimming in the water column, and they are also very important food source for various other species. Now I would like to go into the second concept, into the marine environment from a perspective of goods and services that can be offered via such environment. Marine environment provides enormous and often invaluable goods and services, and it is a fact that these goods and services are supplied and they provide direct and indirect contributions both to the society, to our culture, and to pretty much environment. But as we are pretty egocentric and we look at goods and services from a perspective of our own benefits, then it is also connected to that. These include goods traded in formal market, and those include, for example, feed, various materials coming from the sea, as well as medicines or biologically active agents, which are also available right now. And those which are untradable reliable on some sort of physical markets. For example, here we have a moderation of climate and specifically carbon dioxide capture, pollution control, protection of the coastline, and such services like recreation, for example, which is also connected to our social life. Despite the fact that we are living in a market economy world, and the market economy very much depends on the existence of natural systems. Everything what we actually depends on the global biodiversity as such. And here I mean biodiversity from a perspective of terrestrial and aquatic resources. Values derived from environmental goods and services are often ignored by policy makers, something what we actually should change right now. In 2005, Millennium Ecosystem Assessment provided a typology which basically categorized several ecosystem services into a couple of main groups: provisioning goods and services, regulating and maintaining goods and services, and supportive goods and services. Provisioned goods and services include, for example, food and feed, include also various habitats or enormous amount of habitats globally, which are also home for enormous amount of marine species. Also, marine environment offers various energy sources. First of all, the conventional one, and with our oil and gas resources, for example, and the other one is renewable energy resources. Also, breeding and nursery grounds, which are connected to various habitats as well. Also, we have here several ecological functions and the presence of material and various biomolecules or various biologically active compounds, which can actually be taken from the sea. So what are regulating and maintaining goods and services? First of all, here we have weather. Weather is also connected to climate protection, and here we have carbon sequestration, for example, the ability to control pollutants and various sediment traps, and marine environment offers pretty much a lot about health of the entire planet. So starting from the general climate protection to regulating weather conditions, controlling pollutions, trapping sediments, protecting coastal areas, flow mediation, or something like maintenance. And the maintenance includes various physical, chemical, and biological conditions. And finally, we have supportive goods and services. Here we can speak about the receiving of natural and anthropogenic pollutants. So again, pollution controls in a way. Also detoxification capacity. Earlier days we had this metaphor that the solution to pollution is actually dilution, and dilution was happening exactly in the marine ecosystem, in the big water bodies such as seas and ocean. Mitigatory services, nutrient cycling on a very broad way, primary production, which, as I mentioned previously, is a base of all food webs and food chains, various economic activities which are depending on the marine life, on the marine functions, various physical and intellectual interactions with sea. Here we also have this part which is cultural, spiritual, symbolic. We can distinguish which services are actually provisioned for mankind and which are for the nature. We have, again, for mankind, provisioning, regulating and maintaining, as well as supportive goods and services, but the same goods and services also are seen for the nature. So also here we see something what is provisioning, regulating and maintaining, as well as supportive. We also have to remember that from the perspective of the nature, organisms always become food. They can provide habitats and via their activities they can exert pressure, and they are able to change surrounding environment and surrounding communities. While always habitats, they will give shelters, they will give food, and they also will be serving as breeding and nursery areas. we may actually think about changing our attitude, since from the perspective of humans, an emphasis is often on particular elements of given ecosystem that may be at the moment valuable. What I mean is actually in monetary terms and not in environmentally terms. It is time to possibly change our attitude and to see what common interests we have. So going away from egocentrism and coming to ecocentrism. Paraphrasing inauguration speech of John F. Kennedy, we shall ask not what nature can do for you, but what you can do to save the nature. As you actually see here on this film, it's a little spot which we actually ended up during routine cruising. It is an area where a leakage from one of the shipwrecks is sunk, and this shipwreck is after the Second World War. Here, instead of the sediments, we actually ended up taking enormous amount of oil, which actually was deposited still in the ship tanks. So this is how it looks like when there's an enormous amount of pollution on the sea bottom. Here we have also various threats to the diversity. As I already mentioned, the area, as I'm working mainly in the Baltic Sea area, Baltic Sea is one of the most specific and also very fragile water bodies, known with historically low biodiversity, which is connected to actually very strong salinity gradient, and the salinity changes from west to east, and it decreases strongly from something like approximately 20 PSU up to 1 or 2 PSU. So the Baltic Sea is the largest brackish water ecosystem, which many species are actually living at their physiological limits, mainly because these species are inhabiting especially these low salinity areas, those few that were able to survive the transit of salinity and adapt to the low salinity environment, like for example the blue masses. Also, it is known as one of the most polluted seas in the world, with major biodiversity threats being such as overfishing, eutrophication, alien species, pollution, climate change, several infrastructure, and very heavy ship trafficking. Also, what we have here are some areas with discharges of sewage, wrecks, and munition dumped after or during the Second World War. However, I also have to stress that the condition of the Baltic Sea are now improving, with also various species such as habitat-forming seagrass are now coming back into some areas which were previously deteriorated. You can see on these pictures that those are threats which are occurring not only at the local Baltic Sea level, but most of them are globally recognized threats to the entire ocean biodiversity. As I mentioned, with pollution, earlier days seem to be a very big problem also for the Baltic Sea, but not only for the Baltic Sea, for a general global ocean, as the attitude was that the solution to pollution is dilution, so we can pretty much dump everything to the sea. It's so big that it will take everything and it will actually disappear, and we don't have to worry about that. So there were various ways of doing that. For example, dumping in the sea bottom various munition or different weapon, but also some intentional dumping of, for example, very toxic compounds closed in the barrels and then sunk at the bottom. Also, there were several discharges of raw sewage. We have several agricultural runoffs, a sludge industry, and also some kind of an atmospheric deposition, which we can still see. The problem is with various urban runoffs. What actually types of pollution can we see? There's a very large diversity. So first, what we will be seeing are these sort of conventional pollutants, and those conventional pollutants are like a macro pollutants. Then we have the overwhelming plastic pollutants, and those from nanoplastics up to macroplastics. Then we also have other pollutants, for example, like heavy metals, persistent organic compounds, and various unconventional pollutants. Nowadays, what is actually coming to recognition is something called contaminants of emerging concern. And those are contaminants which are often occurring in various marine areas, not only in the Baltic Sea, but also in the areas which are supposed to be pristine, such as polar areas. And contaminants of emerging concern, here we have, for example, various pharmaceuticals, which are detected in the marine bodies, in the water, but also in the sediments, as well as in the tissues. What happens with the pollution when these substances enter the marine life? They can actually act at various levels of biological organization. Here we see from genes, tissues, cells, tissues, species, up to the population level, and also they can change the trophic web in particular. One of the major sources of the various amount of pollutants can also be connected to purification plant outlets. So of course the purification plant outlets are actually cleaning our sewage, and without them the world would be in a much worse shape. But what happens if or when an incident happens? Then we are having a problem. And the incidents can be connected to various systems, connected to the pipeline as such, but also connected to the purification plant as such. We can have overheating of blowers and lack of air in the system, exceeding drainage limits when we have, for example, enormous storms occurring with a lot of water, and the sludge leakage from the settling tank, low dry matter content of drained sludge, and also serious other malfunctions of, for example, pipelines. Purification plants as such, when they work, they are actually very good in protecting our seas, our areas, and they are able to clean the wastewaters from suspended matter, from nitrogen and phosphorus compounds. They are also good in removing biological oxygen demand or chemical oxygen demand, organic compounds, various various granular particles, several larger contaminants, and many others. However, most of the today's purification plants are not built for actually cleaning substances like, for example, those which include pollutions of emerging concern, like, for example, pharmaceuticals. Here we also have those like phenols and its derivatives and several parabens, silicones, glycols, and many others. What is actually very important when incident happens? We have fully working purification plant, but when incident happens, we have three main ways to actually deal with it. First of all, we cut water from all households, pretty much no water or no sewage production. So then we can use the time we have for repairing the purification plant or a pipeline or anything what got broken. However, this is very unlikely, especially in the larger agglomerations, because people will not be disciplined enough to actually not use water resources, and it's also difficult to demand from people that they are not using water at all. The second way is to transport sewage to the purification plant when the pipeline is broken, using other means of transportation. For example, such big cars which are able to take a lot of sewage. Large cities with a lot of people inhabiting them for actually make this solution pretty much not working, because there are so many sewage to be transported. It's not enough cars for actually transporting all of them. So the third option, and the one that is most often used, is raw sewage discharge directly into the water body. Here in Poland, we had actually recently, within the last couple of years, several of such accidents happening in different purification plants or pipelines of the purification plant. It was usually connected to the pipeline system, where it was really necessary to actually do this raw sewage discharge, or directly to the rivers like the Vistula River, or basically directly to the Bay of Gdańsk, to the main recipient of the sewage. Of course, with the raw sewage, also the various amount of different compounds which are not very much desired in the marine ecosystem, they enter the sea. When it comes to actually those substances which are able to bioaccumulate and biomagnify in the entire web or in this particular species, so we have the process of bioaccumulation, where from the ambient environment, we have various chemical components, like, for example, heavy metals, several pharmaceuticals, persistent organic pollutants, which are able to actually enter the animal's body, and then they can be metabolized or they can be stored in the tissue of a given organism. Most of the organisms, they are interconnected with other levels of food web. They are used as feed by other animals. So that's how it's actually going up the food net, up to the fourth level of consumers. So this the top of the food web or food chain. So here we have the bioaccumulation on the species level and the biomagnification, when it's actually the concentration of a particular compound is increasing in various levels of the food web. And it is the highest in the top predators. Another threat to the biodiversity on a very general level is connected to the climate change. As we know, the ocean is our planet thermostat, and it's pretty much linked to the global climate. With climate change, we actually have rising temperatures, which are responsible for dissolving glaciers or polar ice. That leads to the rising sea. It possibly can threaten people living in low-lying coastal areas. Another problem with rising temperatures actually in some habitats like coral reef, because higher temperatures are causing a phenomenon called coral bleaching, and that occurs when corals are stressed and they are expelling the algae symbionts, and because of losing the symbionts, they are having such a very whitish color. Melting fresh water is also changing the chemical composition of the seawater, and it makes it hard to some species to survive in such a specific environment. Of course, fresh water also changes ocean sea current, and we also have to think about the ocean as our biggest carbon sink, which absorbs a large amount of carbon dioxide emitted by human activities. That itself causes a phenomenon known as ocean acidification, which actually decreases the ocean pHs, and that affects various animals, both calcifying species, like, for example, mussels or snails, or non-calcifying species, like, for example, various worms. Another threat to the biodiversity that can be seen on a global level, but also specifically on the Baltic Sea level, which is related to the nutrients enrichment, and as such to the phenomena such as eutrophication. Nutrient enrichment, here we have the phosphorus and various phosphorus and nitrogen compounds which are entering the water bodies via, for example, agricultural runoffs, but also via the purification plant outlets, so basically already cleaned sewage. And that can not only be directly phosphorus and nitrogen component, but also something called cultural eutrophication, when human water pollution speeds up. And here we also have something like detergents, fertilizers, and other nutrient sources which are entering directly the ecosystem. More nutrients increase primary production, and here we have a phenomenon what is called algae bloom. Algae bloom basically increases amount of debris and suspended matter. Algae bloom is a short phenomenon. During the bloom, water transparency is decreased. After the bloom, all the dead algae are actually going down and they are suspending to the sediments. And then when the first big problem starts, because first we have the aerobic degradation, and after the oxygen sources are used, then we are having anaerobic degradation. The anaerobic degradation is also linked to the fact that the environment around is without oxygen. That is the first thing. The second thing is that also hydrosulfur may occur in such areas. So all that leads to a strong aquatic ecosystems degradation. It's connected to habitats fragmentation, hypoxia, anoxia, hydrogen sulfur, which is very toxic to the marine life wildlife occurrence, and of course several like underwater deserts. Overfishing, just a broad definition, is very self-explanatory, and it occurs pretty much when too many fish are taken and the remaining fish population is unable to reproduce and replenish to the healthy level. This is especially a problem right now when we have a better fishing gear. We know exact location of fish, and we also have a very good infrastructure. Overfishing is one thing, but the other is the ability to recover from the fishing, and the ability to recover from the fishing or overfishing very much depends on the suitable space for recovery. So pretty much we need a very good environmental condition. This also includes various habitats, that includes specific physical chemical variables, good salinity, specific temperature regimes, and of course pollution under control. Sometimes also some interspecies relationships may be a problem. Specifically here we're talking about parasites. Another problem with fishing as such is actually related to the bycatch, which contribute to losing of marine life. This pretty much is everything what is not targeted during the fishing. Therefore, overfishing belongs to multidimensional problems, and it affects various stakeholders. This also exerts a very strong pressure to the entire marine ecosystem. It has also the ability to change the entire ecosystem. So we like to fish a big fish population. So we are actually changing food webs and food chains at its upper consumers. One way of changing, or how we can change, is actually it's marine spatial planning. It can be a platform that could help where economy and nature conservation meets. We take into consideration various sustainable actions, but as for now, undertaken actions are not really outweighing the occurrence of stressors. So the various undertaken actions like national and international laws, global action plans, governmental and non-governmental organizations acting together are not able to outweigh the amount of stressors. And the stressors, eutrophication, overfishing, pollution, climate change, biological invasions, and there are very many more. So most undertaken actions appear not to be able to balance the use of marine ecosystems in such a way it will be a sustainable ecosystem out there. That's why we came up with an idea of marine spatial planning, and here globally ecosystem-based marine spatial planning has become a useful instrument able to coordinate planning of different activities. It also can be used for balancing different requirements of stakeholders, which are sometimes conflicting ones. In the best case, ecology is setting limits to which human activities are acceptable to the society. So here you have a very nice graph, which is like embracing opportunities from Ocean Multi-Use Action Plan. We can see in a pretty chaotic way on this graph how actually we are using this marine space onshore and pretty much on land and in these more shallow and a bit deeper areas. So it's everything from tourism up to the renewable energy, conventional energy sources like oil and gas, as well as cultural needs. Ecosystem-based marine spatial planning is being developed and implemented mainly as a way to foster sustainability in ocean management and use. So it is pretty much seen as a way to foster sustainability. It is able to coordinate and balance divergent marine interests, at least theoretically, because there is a wide range of challenges, such as potential expansion of aggressive activities, something what I call aggressive activities. And this, for example, includes conventional energy sources into the areas which can be used by other stakeholders. So like, for example, oil and gas in the areas used by fisheries and other living marine resources. It also requires evaluation of the marine environment and linked resources. And the evaluation is actually a very important aspect of the whole planning. It also allows to assess the environmental impacts and the risks that such an environment faces. How do we do this evaluation and impacts? In a very brief way, here we have the assessment. We pretty much, for doing a proper planning, for doing a good plan, we need information, and we need multi-sectoral information. So not only from one stakeholder, not from two stakeholders, not from three, we need an information covering all sectors. I will be talking about ecological and environmental sciences, including conservation biology, and that can provide the planner as such with necessary knowledge on environmental conditions. That has to be used as a base for sustainable use and management of natural resources. We have various ways of quality assessment, and this includes biological, chemical, physical, and geological assessment. And for each of them, we need actually to sample raw, we need to get the data. Here, this film introduces you to a very basic sampling directly at the oceanographic vessel. Oceanograph, which is a vessel belonging to the University of Gdańsk. At the first, you had this bathymeter, which is able to take up a water sample from a particular depth of the water column. Now it is actually for the Van Veen grabber, which is taking up the sediment sample and obtaining all, even the smallest individuals living in the sediments, for an analysis that is based on macrobenthic communities. So just to assess such a macrobenthic community, macrobenthos, those are individuals which, as for the Baltic Sea, are actually above 1 millimeter large. So after the first sieving, this goes into the proper looking, and we need to actually sample all the individuals, all the living forms that are in this sample. That can take actually quite a while. So depending on the sediment type, it can be between 30-40 minutes up to actually over several hours. So it is time consuming, and it is also very difficult. Sometimes it also requires skilled knowledge about taxonomy. When it comes to biological monitoring, we have 4 basic types of biological monitoring, and the type 1, which is actually based on indicators, and it is the presence or absence of sensitive resistant species or monitoring of changes in species composition. Biomonitoring type 2, which is based on measurement of pollution concentration in tissues of indicators. Biomonitoring type 3 is actually basing on the cause and effect relationship between the pollutants and its effect. Here we are looking at the various changes that can be informing us about the quality of environment in which specific organism is actually living. And finally, the most modern biomonitoring type 4, which is based on detection of genetically diverse lines of species that developed resistance to a given pollutant. They basically already evolved to tolerate specific substances. Going back here, then we have still chemical, physical, and geological monitoring. Each of those is very important. Chemical monitoring is based on measuring the concentration of various chemicals directly in the water column and in the water sample and in the sediment. Physical monitoring is based on measurement, for example, of sea currents and other factors, and the geological based on other components. I will be focusing on the biological part. Here we have 2 parts for bioindicators, which include organisms which are informative and whose presence, absence, and abundance indicate the quality of abiotic properties of the specific ecosystem. So what happens when there's some change in the environment, in the entire ecosystem related, for example, to worsening of environmental conditions? If we are speaking about the benthic communities or individual communities, so this is the base community, here is a change, and what happens after the change? First, we can observe an increase in number among some specific species, or we can see a reduction reduction in number of among different organisms, there are different species. So some of them will actually be very abundant, some will be disappearing. Sometimes if the change is not strong enough, we will be observing business as usual, so basically no change in the ecosystem. And in the extreme cases, we will have species as elimination, and that will be the elimination of the most sensitive species. Again, coming back to the Baltic Sea, we have, based on a HELCOM group, we have 11 characteristics of good environmental status of marine waters, and here we have the biodiversity, alien species, commercial species, food webs, eutrophication, bottom integrity, hydrological conditions, pollution, biota pollution, waste, and noise. Already in 2003, Water Framework Directive stated requirements for indicators, and right now, nowadays, these requirements are quite complex. First of all, we have to take into consideration species composition, then abundance and share of sensitive and resistant species. So we have all these four parts to be considered: biodiversity, domination, occurrence of resistant species, and occurrence of the sensitive species. For that purpose, we also have various indexes that are developed, and these indexes, they actually are connected to a specific organism. So, for example, within macrobenthic communities, we have something which is called BQE, benthic quality, that is meeting the requirements of Water Framework Directive. We also have another index, for example, for fish, macrophyte index, which is called SMI, other ichthyofauna indexes, and here we have SI or LFI, stands for large fish index. Some of the most known indexes include Saprobic index, and something what I think everybody already heard about is a coliform index. These are all actually ways to look into the pollution, into the environment. So an assessment of water quality, how do we end up with a very good ecological status in Poland? And so very good ecological status only when biological elements are classified as very good, physical and chemical elements are classified as very good, and hydromorphological conditions are typical for very good ecological status. Then we end up with a very good ecological status, first water class. If biological elements are not classified as good or physical elements are not classified as good, then we end up all that way into good ecological status, and then that goes into the second class. Then finally we have the average ecological status, we have poor ecological status, and then we have worst ecological status. Finally, we are going into the biological markers and the biomarkers. What I was talking about just before a while, those were bioindicators. Everything which is a change from the species up to the ecosystem level. So if you look at this graph, it is actually, if we have a risk factor which is acting somewhere here, this change occurs already very late in the ecosystem. Something what we see much faster is actually changes within the given organism, and those are actually biomarkers. So everything which is measurable but within an organism. And it gives us an opinion not only about what is living in the environment, but also how it is living, what is the quality of life. So the biomarker is any biological response to pollution, and it can be measured as biochemical, cellular, physiological, behavioral change in tissues, body fluids, and anywhere else. And it has to be connected to actually environmental status, to particular contamination, or to basically worsening the environmental conditions. Biomarkers have also some weaknesses. They are intrusive. That means that we need to kill, often we need to kill an individual to actually measure something. They respond seasonally, so actually the values which we obtain in winter may not be the same as in summer. They can be dependent. They, for example, are closely related to the sex of individuals, and they can also be variable. That's why we always have to be careful what and how we are measuring. There are three main types of biomarkers: exposure exposure effects and sensitivities. Exposure, that is pretty much everything measurable. It's measurement of exogenous substances and their metabolites. Biomarkers of effect, this is a measurement of all biochemical, physiological, behavioral, and other changes inside the body as a response to a specific stress factor. And biomarkers and sensitivity, they give us an idea about which part of the population is actually more sensitive to a specific component or to specific stressor than the other one. Can, for example, be that females are more sensitive than males. Thank you very much for listening.